ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family tree.
Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show. And this week's show is about evictions in 19th century Ireland. We're going to have a guest on our show today, Tom Barnes, who's going to be talking about his Fahy ancestry. And I just want to talk a little bit about evictions in 19th century Ireland, as land has always been a symbol of status and security in Ireland. However, early in the 19th century, many Irish people did not own their own land. Irish tenants were at the mercy of their landlords, or in some cases, their land agent. Landlords were important to local communities, responsible for maintaining the surrounding country, stimulating the local economy and resolving tenant problems. So, ultimately, landlords were supposed to be the main sources of employment in an area, creating a community for their tenant to live in. While some applied themselves to this role, some did not. And we're going to be talking today about the Marquis of Clanricarde, Hubert de Burgo, probably one of the most hated landlords in Ireland in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. His domain was enormous in size, consisting of 52,600 acres, embracing estates in Loughrea, Portumna, Malik, Woodford, Kilmore, Craughwell, Derrybrien and Crossmacreena, and yielding an annual income of £20,793. That was a massive amount of money in the 19th century. So I'd like to welcome Tom Barnes today to the Genealogy Radio Show. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Lorna. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yes, and we've been doing a lot of work on the Marquis of Clanricarde, and because you have Fahy ancestry in Woodford. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I do. Yes, that's right.
So tell us about your Irish ancestry, Tom.
Will do. I've always been the family genealogist, and I've always loved history, so it's no wonder I've collected a lot of stories that have come down through the family and a lot of artifacts. And through that, I've learned that we're related to the Fahys in Galway, to the Loftuses who came from Castleconner in County Sligo, also related to Milets from County Mayo, and from Hardimans in Cavan.
Yes. And tell us about Anne Faye Loftus.
Be glad to. Anne was my great-great-grandmother, and she was born in Galway in 1825. She was the youngest child of Patrick Fahy and his wife Margaret. There's the possibility that Margaret's maiden name was Kemple because there is a baptismal record for a son named Jacob who was baptized in 1821 in Woodford. And that's the only occurrence we've been able to find of a Patrick and a Margaret Fahy in that area. So perhaps that is her maiden name, Kemple, but we're not sure. Anyway, Anne was born in 1825, the youngest child of Patrick and Margaret. And then after the death of her father, sometime around 1845, 1846, when Anne was 20, she had an inheritance of £2, and she set sail for America at that time, arrived in America, and then worked as a domestic for 6 or 7 years in the Albany, New York, Utica, New York, Clinton, New York area, and then married my great-great-grandfather, James Loftus, and they had 4 children. Now, James, her husband, tragically slipped on ice in 1863 next to a canal lock and fell into the lock. This was at lunchtime. I guess he'd gone home for lunch. He fell into the into the lock of the canal, and he drowned. And then Anne continued for, I think, about another 15 or 20 years, raising all these children on her own. So she was revered by her family for doing all of that. Actually, she finally, I think, died in 1884. But in my mother's corner cupboard, there is a whole set of Delft china. And when I asked my mom, what is that china that's up there, she said, oh, well, Anne Fahey, of course the American name was Fahey, Anne Fahey brought that over with her from Ireland when she came. And so I have that in my possession. We always had a picture of the family cottage because Anne's son, James Patrick, he came over in 1908. He found what he said was our last living relative in Ireland, a gentleman named Michael Stone, who's from Derry Uber East. And during 1908, her son took a picture of the cottage, and we have that. I've shared it with Lorna.
That's right. We've been working on it extensively, and with help from Monica Hines from the Woodford Family Resource Centre. There, we've made great strides with this.
We definitely want to acknowledge the wonderful work that Monica did to go down to the site of
the Fahy house
the
in
Patrick
Durrus.
Fahy house that was part of the Woodford Evictions in 1886 that may well be the cottage that my family came from, and took pictures of all of that. And so many thanks to her.
And to the wonderful work of the Woodford Centre, because it's centres like this that make it possible for us to research when we don't have the local knowledge. You know, you can have all the skill you like, but if you haven't got the local knowledge that's so intrinsic in genealogy research, you're going nowhere, really.
That's right, absolutely, and it's not the first time that one of the centres has been a help to me. I've also been helped by a centre up in Mayo. But what Monica did in going down, I guess the word was the Doreen, down the road.
Boreen.
Down the road to go to the cottage and take the pictures was wonderful. And then you were able to kind of do a comparison of the photograph that I had with what she did, and it does.
We're looking at it from a forensic genealogy point of view of matching what the landscape is like now, and we've got a fair bit of work to do, but we're enjoying that, you know. So
yes, we are.
And just to look at the name Fahy, by the way, and how it corrupts in some cases to Fay in America is very significant to those with Fahy ancestry. That could come from the Irish O Fahy in Gaelic, and it probably originates from the word Fahy, which means base or foundation. Another rarer English version of the name is Fahy, but we're not looking at that in this case. And the name Green has been used as a synonym for Fahy, but it's believed to be another good example of the not common mistranslation of Irish names into English. So it's an exclusively a Galway name, although it's found in the neighbouring county Tipperary. Now, in 1659, when I was looking at the wonderful Irish ancestry site that was John Grenham's in the Irish Times Ancestry, but moved over to he has his own site now, which is a wonderful resource for Irish genealogy. I saw that you could see where the Fahys were in 1659, which was further down south in the country than above in Galway. But they had been expulsed, I presume, by the Cromwellian confiscations at that time in the 1650s. So the Woodford evictions were very significant because this came about as the second phase of the land wars that, you know, a plan of campaign. From 1882 to 1891, the type of land agitation was in the form of a plan of campaign where the people themselves decided to give the landlords the rent that was due and not raise it in price. and start paying fair rents for the time. But of course the landlords did not like that, and the land agents, and they started to evict people. And these were very telling times in the fact that eventually it was by those evictions that the Marquis of Clanricarde actually he really started to annoy everybody so much that they actually took his estates off him around 1908, because he was miserly, known as eccentric, hated by both sides at this stage because of the type of agitation and trouble that was caused in the countryside because of him. So how has the news of Ireland's troubled eviction history impacted on you, Tom?
Well, it's had quite an impression on me. During the years, we certainly knew about the cottage, and then we knew about the footnote that said that they had been evicted in 1886, but I didn't really know what that meant. But with your help, and we started to look into that, and I started to understand much better, first of all, the violent opposition to the evictions that occurred in Woodford in 1886. And when you read about the siege of Saunders Fort, and I assume that the other primary evictions were probably resisted in a similar way, there were hundreds of soldiers and policemen surrounding the houses. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people from the local area standing behind them. And then the inside of the cottages had been filled with rocks and other ways to inhibit people from serving the papers. And then as they came toward the houses, the people inside forcibly resisted with all kinds of means. So it was not just a simple matter of taking the family out of the cottage and moving them away. It was violently resisted, and so this has had quite an impression upon me, thinking about my family and what did they go through at that time, and then once they were evicted, what became of them? Because the last living relative that we had in 1908 that we know of, Michael Stone, from Derry Uber East, told her son, Anne Fay's son, that he was the last living relative. So it makes you wonder, what became of the family after the evictions? Where did they have to go? And if they really did leave Ireland, where did the family all disperse to? Because Anne had other brothers and sisters. What became of the family? So I think it's an impression of the violence of the evictions, and then the sorrow of it all, and then, as you have already said, the Marquis was notorious in London. He was despised in England for his actions, and it is just the cruelty and just having no heart at all for his tenants that comes across as something that is just so terribly sad and unjust, on his part.
And it's also important to note in 1886 to 87 there was a severe depression in this area. So it wasn't a question of tenants didn't want to pay. They could not pay. They could not afford to pay. And you were looking at a situation very similar to the famine at that time. We also have the Bodyke evictions at that time. So for anyone looking for sources and information, that you can go to the Clare Library website, and there's some wonderful accounts of the Holleran evictions at that time, and 4 very striking looking girls who would have barricaded the house and managed to throw scalding hot water onto those trying to get in and all sorts. But one of the accounts I read in the newspaper for the Woodford evictions, which we'll make available online to people who want to read more about it, was one guy decided to, in the court case after, it was shown up in the transcript that he decided to set off a hive of bees and no side liked that, because they all started getting stung, no matter who they were, because as it said in the courts, the bees stung people indiscriminately. They didn't care who they stung in that case. So I thought that was fairly amusing at the time, of all the impacts of people, what they do and how they react at the time, So, Tom, what does it mean for you in your continued work for the Fahey ancestors?
Well, what I would very much like to find out is exactly where the cottage was, and we now know the site of Patrick.
That's correct.
Fahy, who was part of the evictions. He was one of those 4 families that are notoriously evicted in 1886, and it seems more and more likely that that is the family we're talking about. And so I would really like to, finalize and know that I know the site of where the cottage was, and perhaps the cottage still exists, and it's just in a different form now.
Yes.
And then I think, Lorna, you've shared with me that the current resident of the location of the Fahey eviction
Fahy's, yeah,
is Thomas Fahy.
Yes.
And he may be a relative of mine, and they may have repossessed the house once the Marquis was no longer in control of it.
Yes, because that's very significant, because certain people did get their lands back from these repossessions. So that is very telling at that time, that we need, that, okay, people were evicted, but maybe certain branches of the family moved back when they could, when the political strife was over at that time. And because of the dispossession, in this case, from the Marquis of Clanrickarde, where it was by forcible purchase, as far as I know, that estate was purchased off him. That's where we have a significant, long before the War of Independence or the Land Commission or anything like that, we have redistribution or reallocation or maybe return of lands in an eviction sense. So what do you want to find out on your visit to Ireland in the near future? And I'm hoping it's going to be near rather than a long way off, Tom. You have promised me you'll get over.
It definitely won't be a long way off. And I visited Ireland several times. I've actually driven through Portumna a few times, and a few years ago my wife and I visited the Portumna Castle, not really realizing what it was. And then as we got into the castle, and the gentleman who was doing the admissions was very kind and gently informed me that if my relatives were from the area southeast of Portumna, then they probably were evicted by the Marquis, and that this was his castle. So it became very real. When we do come over, I really would like to spend several days in the area. I'd like to have a chance to certainly meet with you, Lauren. I'd like to thank Monica in person. I'd like to visit the site of what we think is our cottage. If there's a graveyard by any chance that might have Patrick Fahy and his wife Margaret in it, or part of the family, I would love to do that. And then I think...
there is a Dowrus graveyard, and it's Dowrus rather than Durrus, because I keep calling it Dowrus, yeah.
Okay. And I think finally I would just like to spend some time in the area, because I know how beautiful Ireland is, and I know how beautiful the people are. I've always enjoyed being there, and I would just like my wife and I have a chance to sort of revel in the history of it, to think about our family who lived in that cottage for many, many generations, according to our notes, and just sort of soak in the area and think about the life of my family in that area up until at least 1886, and then just enjoy the scenery, the people, and the experience of being there.
That's wonderful, Tom, and thank you so much for your time today and your energy and your enthusiasm for agreeing to come on the Genealogy Radio Show on this topic and sharing your quest and and by the way, Tom did the most fantastic map, which I would like to make available online, Tom, with your permission, on using Griffith's valuation and the different portions of land, the way you mapped it.
Oh, certainly, absolutely.
Oh, because that was just so wonderfully done. I mean, I'm showing that to students as the way to do things. It was just marvellous. I have never seen it done as well as that. So this is what I'm always trying to say. Nobody does their family history as good as the family themselves, because they've got an investment in themselves to do this. So nobody should be put off from researching or thinking, oh, I wouldn't be able to do that now. I couldn't do that, because they can. They know more about their families than anybody else does, and it'll make more sense to them than perhaps somebody who thinks they have a lot of knowledge but wouldn't have the same empathy and so on. So, Tom, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. And I'll be speaking to you soon, as you know, so we'll continue the matching of the walls and the bits and pieces and so on. Okay.
Thanks for having me on, Lauren. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Tom. Now, just to make some announcements on the genealogy events for the Genealogy Radio Show, we're going to be doing the genealogy summer school at UCC, Ancestral Connections, and that starts on the 26th of June and runs to the 2nd of July. We have day rates, we have weekly packages, we have all sorts of things, and we're still open for booking. That is an absolutely wonderful summer school, and we will have lectures. If you're keen on actually going into lectures and so on, please contact me on l.maloney, MOLONEY, @ucc.ie, because we'll be able to accommodate you in some form. Now, just in relation to leases and the Ejectment Act, to finalise here, to make things more complicated, by the beginning of the 19th century, leases were being made for shorter periods of time. So things were worsening in Ireland in the 19th century. It was a lot easier to evict tenants once a lease was up, allowing landlords and land agents to use the land for more profitable advantage. They could lease it to another tenant for a higher rent, and long leases had prevented landlords from increasing their rents from around 1750 until 1815. Before 1815, landlords were restricted by legal procedures and heavy expenses necessary to expel a tenant from their lands. However, the Ejectment Act of 1816 transformed the system, allowing landlords to bring a tenant whose rent was no more than £50 a year to local court. If successful, the legal cost of the ejectment decree was less than £2. Consequently, throughout the 1820s, if a landowner came up against opposition, tenants refusing to pay certain rents, they could evict the resistant parties for a relatively cheap price. So all this is very important. The history and rack renting used by landlords as a means of surreptitiously evicting tenants. Landlords or land agents would keep raising the price of rent until a tenant could no longer pay, getting rid of unwanted tenants by bankrupting them. And this really is enlarged what happened in relation to the Woodford evictions as well, to some extent. Things were being put up, things were changing. We see the sources here for the Woodford evictions from the 1850s, and sources I would have used in the research on this for Thomas Barnes would have been moving forward on the National Archives, which gave a great deal of sources. And there were poems, books, PDFs, so on. So, very significant sources in evictions and what it can tell us about names, places, court cases, and where you look at the newspaper accounts after and you see the tragedy that occurred, and they didn't care if your grandmother was 88 or 90 years of age. Out you went, and that was it. So today's show has been very, very interesting, and I've been delighted to interview Thomas Barnes, who's a descendant of the Faheys of Woodford. And thank you very much for listening to the Genealogy Radio Show today. We air on www.rcb.ie. You can email us on info@rcb.ie. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, Radio CB. So talk to you next week. Goodbye for now.
Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think, if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.